Hello all, Ben Shute here at the University of St. Andrews Music Center. I'm wondering how many of us have found it strange that as students and aspiring professionals, so many of the performance contexts that we have bear very little resemblance to the professional world that we're supposedly training for. I'm thinking particularly of the way that we study 18th century concertos as a core of our repertoire, which they absolutely are, and then so often turn around and play them with modern piano, which simply isn't done in the professional world. It is quite apart from the question of period instruments and all of that sort of thing. You can make a better case for 19th century concertos being played with piano because so many of the composers themselves wrote piano reductions of what was by then a very large orchestral texture managed by a conductor and whatnot. And they did that so that their concerti could be heard in recital contexts where a full symphony orchestra wouldn't be available. But the 18th century is actually quite a different matter. I mean, for one thing, the modern piano as such didn't really exist, but also whereas in the 19th century, as I said, the orchestras would have been led by a conductor. In the 18th century, they would have been led by the concertmaster, who also would be taking the solo, which makes it all the more problematic when we get to the end of a solo episode and then stop and let the piano take over. Right? The whole concerto dynamic just doesn't function the same way. And that's especially true, of course, in Baroque repertoire, where, ironically, many violin concertos are simply scored with a string tutti, which means that it actually isn't that difficult in, say, a student recital context to get even a quartet of peers together. Now, if you can get continua with that, so much the better. I know availability differs at different institutions, but at least getting a quartet together to play with you will give you, I think, a much more satisfying experience, but also allow you to experience much more what it would be like to play these pieces in a professional context. It gets more difficult for me in the late 18th century, in the era of Mozart and Haydn, because most concertos then have a wind component, which requires more strings to balance against them. And so the orchestra is getting bigger and bigger, and it's really harder to perform a Mozart concerto with a proper classical orchestra. But as I said, performing it with piano is, to me, a bit problematic. Fortunately, in the case of the fifth violin concerto by Mozart, it's actually quite viable without the winds. And that actually parallels one thing that Mozart indicated for some of his piano concertos. Some of his piano concertos are specifically constructed to be viable without winds, and they do work in a one per part string scoring. So it can be played with a string quartet and piano solo. And the same thing actually works with the fifth concerto. Unlike the piano concertos, we have no explicit indication from Mozart that that's what was on his mind. But quite unlike the previous four violin concertos, the fifth works quite well without the winds. It does require a few little tweaks in the string scoring, but is actually really viable. So I've created an edition for solo violin and string quartet with optional contrabass that's up on IMSLP. I'll link that in the comments below. But what I'm hoping that will do is remove this either or between playing the concerto with piano or having to do a full-out classical orchestra, or simply not playing it at all. Those aren't satisfying options, I think. And it's a shame if students for whom a full orchestra might not always be available wouldn't have the opportunity to perform it in a proper ensemble context. So I'm hoping that will be useful for both professionals and students alike. Please feel free to check it out, program it if you like. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm always happy to hear thoughts and feedback. So I hope that will provide a lot of enjoyment. I will just add, I've played the concerto. I created the edition for a student of mine and played in this one per part string tutti in his senior recital. And it was a great deal of fun. It cast the concerto in a completely different light than in the full orchestral scoring. And it's just different. It brings a different, a more intimate dynamic. There's more give and take. It really feels a lot like chamber music, like a chamber concerto. And it really is very great fun. So yes, please do feel free to check it out and let me know what you think.